Hello and welcome to this video on how muscles contract. Contraction of muscles is essential for many things in your body, not just moving parts of your body such as your hand, but contraction of cardiomyocytes, arterial walls, bronchioles, intestines, and the list could go on. This is why muscle contractions are practically essential to life. You have three types of muscle: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac in your body. Each is made up of the same broad basic elements. For starters, we can look at skeletal muscle, otherwise known as striated muscle. Each of them is made up of individual muscle fibers. Each of these fibers are made up of much smaller units called myofibrils. These are very much like strands within a rope. They run lengthways down the long length of the rope itself, or in this case the muscle. And then you have thicker filaments as well. The filaments are arranged longitudinally, and each of their sections is called a sarcomere. The reason why they're called striated muscles is, well, each of these sections creates a striation under a microscope, and you can clearly see it. The thick filaments and the thin filaments work together, with the thick filaments being made from something called myosin. This is a protein, and it's one part of the chains that make it possible for the muscle to move. There are two heavy chains and two light chains. These are the functional unit of your muscle, and each of these is called a myofibril. The myofibril itself can be found at the end of the filament, and it's where the two come together. It's also where it will pull against each other. This pulling motion is made possible by the heavy chain being paired with light chains, and each of the light chains has a myosin head. This has an actin binding site, and this is what allows them to bind to the thin filament. The thin filament is made up of something called actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. For the most part, actin is the important thing here, as it works with the actin globules to form strands between each part of this. It's effectively a magnet, and that magnet binds to a positive and a negative end. When your muscles aren't active, they're covered by tropomyosin, and this blocks the actin from being able to do anything. When your muscles are attempting to contract, the tropomyosin is moved, and this allows the troponin to interact, and that then allows it to bind with the tropomyosin and pull. There are four types of striated muscle contractions overall: isometric, isotonic, concentric, and eccentric. Isometric contraction is generally characterized by a change in the muscle tension, but not in length. Isometric is when you are pushing as an immovable object effectively, so think of stationary stretches. Isotonic is when your muscles have a constant muscle tension, but they don't change in length. Think of this as when you're trying to hold your fist tightly. Then you have concentric striated muscle contractions, and these are generally used when you need to express more strength. The muscles contract, but they also shorten, so this is what you would do when you're lifting weights. Then you have the eccentric striated muscle contractions, and this is when your muscles work to the end of a movement. Think of something like trying to protect a joint from damage when you're running. Your foot hits the ground hard, and you need to mitigate that by the muscles stopping suddenly. Each of the three types of muscle within your body, cardiac, skeletal, and smooth, have their own means of contraction, although overall the processes are largely similar. When we talk about skeletal muscle contraction, we have the action potential, which is the neural signal coming to the muscle. At the end of the neuron, you get the release of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is then going to attach itself to the muscle fiber membrane. What is important here is that the acetylcholine opens acetylcholine-gated cation channels. This allows sodium to flow into the muscle fiber. This causes depolarization, and it opens up other voltage-gated channels, specifically sodium voltage-gated channels. This then perpetuates the action potential by causing depolarization of the muscle membrane. This then causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium ions stored within the reticulum itself. These calcium ions are necessary as they are the attractive force between actin and myosin filaments. This causes them to move alongside each other, leading to contraction beginning. After just a fraction of a moment, the calcium ions are pushed back out and into the sarcoplasmic reticulum by calcium membrane pumps, and then it remains stored there until a new action potential arrives. As calcium is essential for this action to occur, removing it from the myofibril causes the muscle contraction to stop. When we talk about cardiac muscle contraction, it is largely similar but much shorter in its performance, largely because, unlike your skeletal muscles, your cardiac muscles are in some ways simpler but also working much more frequently and harder. First you get the action potential arriving, and it goes through various neurons to get there. Importantly, we have the sinoatrial node and the cells within it which allow for the pacemaking function. That is, it controls the rate at which your heart beats. There are also similar cells, particularly neurons we're talking about here, found within the atrioventricular node. These pass the action potential down and through the heart itself. As it passes through different parts of the heart, it initiates the sarcomeres, and these activate the calcium channels in T-tubules, which are very similar to the rest of these cells in a skeletal muscle. This causes calcium to rush in just the same. Once calcium is entered, you have troponin C, and this becomes a complex with the actin binding site. Once you remove the actin through the calcium, you get free actin, and this free actin allows myosin to initiate the contraction. So, calcium is necessary again. The calcium is then removed by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and as with skeletal muscle, decreasing calcium concentrations cause the muscles to relax. Finally, we have smooth muscle contractions. Smooth muscle behaves in a manner almost exactly the same as skeletal muscle, except you have very little, if absolutely no, control over it, cognitively speaking. That is, you can't consciously tell your intestines to stop contracting. Contraction is not regulated as much, if at all, by calcium binding to the troponin complex, however. The way it works is that the intracellular calcium concentration increases when calcium enters the cell, and it is then released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This binds to a new item that is fundamentally similar to myosin or tropomyosin, called calmodulin. The calmodulin is then able to allow myosin to be accessed and active. Once you have this, you have phosphorylation, and it increases its activity. Once you have phosphorylation and increased activity, muscle tension begins to happen. The result of this is that you need the calcium to allow it to happen, and when you lose calcium, as will eventually happen, the contraction begins to cease, and it gets pumped back out of the cell or back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Once you get to a low enough concentration, the calcium begins to unbind itself from the calmodulin, and then all of the calcium is removed from it. This then leads to the phosphate being removed from it as well, and that then causes the muscle tension to cease entirely. Although individually the processes are fundamentally the same, cardiac muscles are something of an outlier and should be treated a little differently. But there are, let's say, commonalities to skeletal and smooth muscle cells. It's just that the structure of the muscle cells involved are somewhat different and a little unique. But you can think of them as having contemporary parts that you can draw parallels to. Overall, you can see just how much goes into, for example, moving your hand and allowing your heart to beat, or moving food from your stomach down into your intestine and then out the other end. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.